Hi everybody, how are you? Thanks for coming today. We put together a presentation. We're going to give everybody a printout from the presentation that we put on today because we want to cover a lot of the records that were released over the weekend from apparently, I think it was Mr. Bates' attorney. So that's generally what we're going to be focusing on today. And then for a little bit of time, we're going to respond to some of the things that were stated at the press conference this morning. And so 2 weeks ago, a lot of you weren't here because the story was just kind of breaking. My brother said something, and I think it's really important that people understand kind of what our purpose is with it. Chris, can you put it?
The Tulsa County Sheriff's Department was as transparent as it alleged to be. Everything that we worked on. There wouldn't be anything that was being hidden from the public. And we are going to show that you don't have to file a lawsuit to get those things exposed.
A lot of the press has asked us if we're going to file a lawsuit or if we're planning on filing a lawsuit or when we're going to file a lawsuit. And right now that's not our focus. Our primary focus is fulfilling a promise that we made to Eric Harris and Andre Harris. My brother is 13 months older than me. Eric Harris was 13 months older than Andre. And I promised Andre that I would investigate this case as if it was my brother who had been gunned down in Tulsa, not his. And so that's our purpose right now, is exposing the truth and investigating all the claims. And with that, I want to talk about specifically the gun certification records. Firearms training, it's a critical piece of this story. None of the records produced by the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office or Mr. Bates' attorney, whoever produced them, indicate that he was ever certified with a .357 revolver. The records here, and we're going to again give you guys handouts of all of this. There was field firearms training record for a AR-15. If you'll see here, all the records that were produced has a model number and a serial number place. That's critical, and I'll show you why. And then when you go and you do firearms training, you have 3 separate opportunities to qualify. If you score above a 72 on your first round or at any point in time during your shooting, then you're automatically qualified. So here we have a qualification, 2009, again for an AR-15, not the weapon that was used to kill Eric Harris. Next slide, Chris. He also tried to qualify with a SIG. It's a different type of firearm. It's a picture of what it looks like. There was a training record that was produced regarding the SIG that Mr. Bates fired. Again, you see here, model is a SIG, serial number, and there's no score on this particular sheet. Safety instructors were R. Chapman, Eric Kitch, and I don't know necessarily what this indicates, other than it certainly doesn't indicate that there was a score given. I don't know if it indicates that he missed at every level, but again, not a certification for a .357 revolver that was used to kill Eric Harris. Next slide. There were numerous records regarding Mr. Bates' record with the Glock, which is the standard service weapon. We had not seen these records until they were actually released over the weekend, and I was really happy that they released them because it confirmed a lot of the things that we had been hearing through inside sources that at this point in time aren't comfortable enough to come out. But just so you guys are aware, and I know some of the media has already hit on this fact, in his first round, Mr. Bates scored a 16 out of 100 shots. And if you know how the certification works, you start at a close range, and then you back up, and then you back up again, another 25 yards. I would imagine that anyone could hit at least 12 of the shots, whether you're trained or not, because you're so close to the target. Once he backs up, he makes 4 more shots, at least according to this record, and then from there on back doesn't hit the target at all. I think it's surprising at best that he scores 72 on the last round, which again is the minimum qualification you have to be in the field. And most important, again, we're talking about a .45 caliber Glock, not a .357 that was used to shoot Eric Harris. Next slide. Remove. Okay. Just so you guys know what's going on here, this is I wanted to just point out this record because the pistol and the caliber of the pistol are not mentioned here. And I contemplated that maybe this had been produced because either Mr. Brewster, Mr. Wood, or somebody from the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office was going to try to argue that while it was not identified, this was the training record for, or the certification record for the 357. But you'll see here that the serial number is LMR 291. That's the same serial number that is assigned to Mr. Bates' 45 Glock. So again, just look out for that. If someone were to say that to you, that would be incorrect. Next slide. 2011 report. You'll see here written, it says no kneel. What that means is that there was an exclusion given to Mr. Bates. Generally, during the certification process, you're required to kneel from 25 yards away. And that exception was made for Mr. Bates, and that's what that's showing, where it says no kneel. He wasn't required to kneel and do the shooting. Next slide. This is another day, no kneel, September 2011. Again, these are all related to the Glock. No records have been produced with respect to the 357. But on this day, somehow Mr. Bates was able to improve his score from a 16 on the previous sessions to an 80, 84, and 84, which was some of the highest of any deputy that was firing that day. Next slide. This is a 2014. I know that Mr. Brewster has publicly said that I believe the 12 and 13 records were missing, and we're going to touch on that. But here, you don't see Mr. Bates' name appear anywhere on the log. You see it appear down here at the bottom. Again, the LMR 291, that's the Glock 45 service weapon. I have an issue with this because, frankly, why don't you just put his name on another sheet? Why wasn't another sheet started? Why does it come at the end? Why is there only one round? Why is he going from a 16 to a 76 or an 80 or an 84? I have serious issues with that from a training standpoint. Next slide. Okay, so the 357, this is what was used to kill Eric Harris. It was a personal weapon owned by Mr. Bates. It was a hammerless weapon, which means it's double action. You don't have to cock the hammer to shoot it. The laser beam that you've heard them talk about, laser sight. So there's like a little tiny button right there that automatically turns on when you squeeze the trigger. It's really different from what they're trying to spin with the taser. The taser has a separate mechanism up here, and you can see if you look on the website for the taser company, you have to manually turn the laser beam sight on. Okay, this is an automatic mechanism that's built into this particular weapon if it's ordered that way. There's a lot of interesting things to me about the weapon that was actually used to kill Eric Harris, which we'll get to once we start talking about that, not today, but in the future. Next slide. Yep, they have produced no training, no records, no certifications, and no qualifications for Mr. Bates' use of a 357. I want to show you what their policies state specifically about weapons training and qualifications. This is their official policies. Weapons authorization. A deputy or reserve deputy may only carry a weapon if they receive training on the weapon's safe and proper usage and qualify with it. There's been no record to substantiate any of that, let alone the qualification of it. The weapon must meet the proper specifications and be inspected by the Sheriff's Office firearms instructor, armorer, or other certified weapons officer for that particular type weapon. To be considered approved, a weapon must initially be issued to the deputy by the Sheriff's Office. We know from Mr. Bates' statement that he made the Monday following Eric's shooting that this was a personal weapon. It wasn't a weapon that was issued by the Sheriff's Office. Again, a policy violation according to their own internal policies. The policy specifically talks about the weapons that are approved in Section D. None of those that are approved by the Sheriff's Office own policies include a 357 Smith & Wesson. Next slide. Okay, so this is more from their internal policies, the firearms qualifications. The training unit will schedule training sessions biannually, and this is absolutely critical, I think, to the Eric Harris case. The training will be conducted by a CLEAT certified firearms instructor, and a permanent record showing the deputy's shooting score will be maintained by the training unit. I'm curious as to why there's a requirement for permanent record retention by the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office, and the records that have been produced were supposedly found in Mr. Bates's garage after 2 weeks after the shooting. But clearly, by their own policy, they were required to keep a permanent record, not one that could be shredded, not one that could be disappear with some Secret Service person that worked there 5 years ago. They have an obligation, according to their own policies, to keep a permanent record. They must pass, flip back real quick. All deputies must pass a qualification course annually with a minimum score of 72%. Again, we're missing years from Mr. Bates's qualifications, and again, none of those qualifications indicate that he was ever qualified with a 357 revolver in 2015 or 2014, any year. Next slide. Okay, so there's a provision in their policies that talks about other weapons. They might raise this with you, and I just want you to be aware of it. No deputy, reserve, any type of deputy, is permitted to carry and use a weapon until they have received training and are qualified as proficient in its use by a certified weapons instructor. All approvals are conditional on annual requalification. That's their internal policy. This isn't CLEAT. This is what they're absolutely required to do under their own internal policies. Next slide. Okay. Provision L of their policies, the Sheriff's Office will maintain a complete record of all authorized weapons, which lists the following: type and description of the weapon, model and serial number if the weapon is a firearm, and the owner or assignee of the weapon. Again, none of those records have been produced with respect to Mr. Bates's 357 revolver, likely because it was his personal weapon and wasn't even proper to be, it was not proper to be carrying the weapon, period. Next slide. Okay, so I've heard them argue two different things. One was that Mr. Bates was off duty and he was just down at the Sinclair gas station and happened to be in the area. The other was that he's been assigned to a crime task force, or whatever they call it. So there's a provision for off-duty carrying of firearms. Again, off-duty weapons must meet the same requirements as weapons used on duty, including training, approval, and authorization. So even with that argument, their own internal policies dictate that Mr. Bates's 357 had to be qualified and certified, and he had to be trained on it, which they've produced no record of. Next slide. Okay, so the field training records. There's only 24 hours of documented field training that they've provided to the media in their 65-page release over the weekend. And so I want to, at least for the purposes of the press, to walk them through this because it can be somewhat complex. There's 3 forms that are part of field training documents. The first form is a daily observation report, and this is what it looks like. Okay. And it's a double-sided form. On the back side of the form, this is the front side, and it has very specific scoring criteria. And then on the reverse side of the form, you have a narrative evaluation. Okay. And that's what this looks like, where the field trainer will put a narrative about the type of training that was involved in that particular field training. And then the third page of the form is your operations daily activity log. I'll show you what that looks like. And so it's a detailed log, okay, from the time as the day progresses during the training. They detail everything like a logbook as to what training took place that day. And the specifics, that way you can cross-reference it with police reports, sheriff's office reports, and see that it actually, these things happened. They've only produced 24 hours of field training records. Next slide, Chris. keep going. Same thing again. These are the 20. I went ahead and attached the 24 hours that they showed, and you guys will have it in the handout. Next one. Okay, so the reason why field training is so important is because they have a specific reserve deputy program as part of their policies and procedures. Okay. This is not field training, but I want to talk with you guys about this because you've heard them talk about cleat training as well. So all reserve deputies will be required to complete 23 hours of cleat training and 2 hours of mental health training each year. Next slide. Even the cleat records that they first produced in this case showed that Mr. Bates only did 1 hour of mental health in 2012. It might not seem like a lot to you guys, but it's really critical because at this point in time, Mr. Bates should have been suspended or terminated pursuant to their policies. And maybe Eric wouldn't have been shot if that had actually happened and they'd followed through with their policies. Okay, so back to the field training. The Advanced Classification Reserve Deputy will complete and document 480 hours of TCSO Field Training Officer Program. The Advanced Classification Reserve Deputy is the only reserve deputy classification that may perform normal field duties by themselves and without the direct supervision of a certified deputy. You've heard them in the very beginning of the Eric Harris shooting talk about Mr. Bates could do everything that a regular deputy could do. He's an advanced reserve. All of that you heard. Next slide. Okay, so before we get to this, Mr. Bates in his statement said he was assigned or became an advanced reserve deputy in 2007. You're fine. Don't hurt yourself getting out. You don't have to. What's important about that is they've put forward some records, and we're going to get to this in a minute. But there's absolutely no field training records prior to 2007 that have been produced, which is when Mr. Bates says he was assigned as an advanced deputy. What they have produced, and these are pretty good. They've produced these records here. These are not training records. These are like you fill these out if you're actually working on the job. It's kind of like just to track your time and what you're doing. They were part of the packet that Mr. Brewster and Mr. Wood submitted to the press over the weekend. And they're troubling for several reasons. One is, to the extent that they're trying to say these are field training documents, that's false. I mean, I've showed you what the field training documents look like and what's required. These are more or less time slips. But what's troubling to me about them, beyond that they're trying to be shown as training records, is we've got all these dates, right? 11th, 12th, 15th, 17th, 19th, 23rd, 25th, 26th, 29th. Doesn't have a year. Doesn't say what was happening. And it's signed by Mr. Bates and a guy by the name of Tom Huckabee. And we're going to get to why that's important here in a minute. Every single record that was produced over the weekend that looks like this is either not signed or it's signed by Tom Huckabee. Next slide. And you could go through that packet because I think the media has it. Okay, so this is Major Tom Huckabee. And the reason why he's important is because he is the commander over the Violent Crimes Task Force. Okay? That's his job. He's a major at the sheriff's office. And the way that breaks down is you've got the sheriff and then the undersheriff. And then you've got certain administrative captains, and then underneath that you have the majors. They changed their structure, I think it was last year or the year before last, and they added a new position of major. The reason why Tom Huckabee is important, again, is one, he is in charge, and you can actually hear them talk about him in the video that the sheriff's office released with the guys in the car after the shooting, and they said, Huckabee's going to have to come down here. Okay? They're referring to Tom Huckabee. We know that because Tom Huckabee's son, Michael Huckabee, is the one that you see in the video with his knee on Eric's head, the one with the tattoo. So, who is his son? That's Michael Huckabee. This is not the first time that I've dealt with one of the Huckabees. In 2009, I did a series of race discrimination cases that were ultimately resolved. And we were able to ascertain in that process some things that were disturbing to us in a racial context. Do you have that video? So I took his deposition May 4th of 2010, and this is Tom. This is Michael's dad. Michael's the one with his knee on Eric's head. You're going to go.
Defense counsel also asked you about your tattoos. Do you recall that? Yes, sir. Did you recall in your deposition just several days ago that you could not recall where you had received the tattoo with the skull, the flames, and this particular cross? Do you recall that? I don't recall. And over the weekend, I'm assuming that sometime you recall that you got that surgery, correct? Yes, sir. And you also acknowledged in your deposition last week, did you not, that you were aware that that cross had been used by the Nazis during World War II?
I think I acknowledge that it was used by several organizations or entities throughout history.
And did you acknowledge that one of those organizations was the Nazis?
Yes, sir.
You believe it was first used by the Romans, correct?
Actually, the Prussians actually introduced it.
Did you do some research over the weekend regarding that emblem?
No, sir. I did some research as to where I got it.
So the tattoo is not the most troubling thing to me about Mr. Huckabee being assigned to the Violent Crimes Task Force. In 2010, the same year that I was working on this case, an affidavit was filed by a Caucasian female who worked in the jail. She worked master control. She was also one they called, and you've heard it referred to in the Sheriff's Department as a SORT team, the team that would go into the jail and they'd basically shake down people and see if they had contraband in their jail cells, because there aren't any cameras in the jail cells. Ms. Moody signed an affidavit in 2010, I believe, and it was submitted in this case, and it's part of the public record. I've provided an attachment of it for your handout today. When you leave, you can pull the case up. It was in front of Federal Judge Kern, and it was consolidated. I believe there were 6 or 7 plaintiffs in that, all former African-American employees. And in the affidavit, Ms. Moody states specifically, while I was on the SORT team before I became pregnant, I commonly witnessed Captain Huckabee, he was a captain at the time, now he's a major, and other Caucasian officers go into African-American inmate cells and physically assault them for no reason. There was no reason for Captain Huckabee to have entered the cells, as there is a small door where items can be passed through and inmates and officers could speak through the doors without opening them. Captain Huckabee was the main officer who would assault the African-American inmates, and there would rarely be an incident report made, and the nurses and medical would never be called, even though the inmate would be swollen and it was obvious that he'd been beaten up. Captain Huckabee would do this unprovoked. Captain Huckabee would mainly do it in segregation where there are no cameras, and the majority of inmates are African-American. If, in the rare occasion, Huckabee did fill out an incident report, I was told that he was to fill out his first, and myself and the other officers were to corroborate Huckabee's version of the facts, which were not usually accurate. This was in direct violation of policy, as medical was to be called any time there was an altercation of any sort or any inmate was injured. Further, policy required an incident report to be filled out every time an altercation occurred. Captain Huckabee was in direct violation of policy, and so were the other Caucasian officers who participated in the physical assaults, and they were not disciplined. So, while I have a problem with that, and I certainly had a problem with it in these earlier cases, what bothered me the most was after these cases were resolved, Tom Huckabee was promoted by the sheriff's office to the position of major, which put him in direct control of the Violent Crimes Task Force. And I'll tell you why else Mr. Huckabee is so important. Is because he's got a personal relationship with Bob Bates, the man who shot Eric Harris. We can talk about this now if we need to. That's fine. One of the things, can we come back to it? We'll come back to the internal affairs investigations real quick at the end. So here's the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office. This is their org sheet. And so here are the people that I want to kind of explain how this works, okay? So you've got the sheriff, Stanley Lands, and you've got the undersheriff, Tim Albin. Albin was promoted to that position after Brian Edwards took a position at the Grand River Dam Authority, which is where he currently is in charge of. You heard Sheriff Lands reference Mr. Edwards this morning, and you heard him in specific reference to an internal affairs investigation into Bates's training records that occurred 6 or 7 years ago is what he'd said. Go back to the IA. Okay, so there's an internal affairs policy that the Sheriff's Office has in their policies and procedures manual, and it requires the information with respect to the internal affairs investigations to be stored in the Sheriff's Office. I am asking the Sheriff's Office to produce to the media a copy of the internal affairs investigation that took place by Sergeant Robbie Lillard at the direction of Under Sheriff Edwards in 2008. Where are those records? Because up until this morning, everyone from the Sheriff's Office seemed surprised that there was even an allegation that these records had been falsified, and I'm asking them to provide the IA file. You can redact the names, you can redact the personal identifiers, produce this record that was created at the direction of Under Sheriff Edwards in 2008. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so back to these guys. This is Sheriff Stanley Lands. This is the Under Sheriff Tim Albin. This is Tom Huckabee. Again, he is the major over the Violent Crimes Task Force. This is F Your Breath guy, Byers. This is Knee on Your Head guy, Mike Huckabee, who's being supervised by his dad. And we've got Shannon Clark, who's a detention major, and Billy McKelvey, who's an admin captain. And I don't know why Mr. McKelvey's having the involvement that he's had in this case, because it's outside of really what his job is. The meeting with Andre at the gas station, the press releases coming out and talking to the media. It's odd to me that he's taking that position because, again, he's over in the detention division, which is the jail. Next slide. Okay, so this is based on what we've heard from sources as well as has been reported in the media. Bob Bates, the guy who shot Eric Harris, has provided vacations, money, and cars to Stanley Lands, Tim Albin, Tom Huckabee, and Michael Huckabee. Okay? He's also, when they talk about his donations, his community donations to the Sheriff's Department, I believe that primarily all those donations have been to the Violent Crimes Task Force, not to other aspects of the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office, like the Children's Outreach Program that they have. It's all been specifically given to the same individuals that were involved in Eric Harris's shooting. Next slide. Okay. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to address, I've seen the sheriff up there talking about Kalia and the Kalia investigation. You guys were asking a lot of questions about the Kalia investigation. Kalia was in town a couple weeks ago during the shooting of Eric Harris, just by chance. They come every year. And what Kalia is, it's a private organization that Sheriff Lands pays to be a part of. And what they do is they give him a certification. It's a Kalia certification. And it's part of Sheriff Lands, is what he's referred to as the Triple Crown. And you can see it on all the vehicles that they drive. There's a Triple Crown emblem. What that stands for is NCCHC, which is the national, it's like correctional health care. That's a private group that you pay to be part of to get their certification. ACA, and then Kalia is the third one, and that makes up the Triple Crown. And you see that emblem on all the vehicles that are in the Sheriff's Office. All Kalia does is they come in and they look at the same handbook that I was showing you excerpts from to see that their excerpts or that their handbook meets national standards. They don't check to see if they're actually following the policies, okay? They just are there to make sure that they have them. And they do. They have all the policies. And this is a quote from a case out of the 8th Circuit, and it's actually been addressed by Judge Dowdell in a federal case that I have in the Northern District that's been pending for some time against the Sheriff's Office. And the quote is this: "However, the existence of written policies of a defendant is of no moment in the face of evidence that such policies are neither followed nor enforced." And that's Ware versus Jackson County, Missouri. Relying on that same language, Judge Dowdell found in a case that I have against Stanley Lands and the Sheriff's Office, as well as their private medical provider, involving medical neglect of inmates, he said, quote, "The evidence submitted in this case creates genuine issues of material fact as to whether and to what extent the written policies were followed or enforced by the sheriff and his jail staff." I want to talk about, just briefly, the other cases that we have against them, because I hear Mr. Brewster talking about the plaintiff's attorney this and the plaintiff's attorney that, and they have all these cases against us. I do have a lot of cases against them, and I have for a number of years. I've been working against the Sheriff's Department for almost a decade, with everyone in the office as well, who've been a tremendous help. Many of those cases involve deaths of inmates that we believe are directly related to Sheriff Lands' unconstitutional policies and customs. The Eric Harris case is disturbing, and we see it as part of a continuing pattern of TCSO's indifference to the safety of inmates and citizens in Tulsa, Oklahoma. We will continue to pursue these cases on behalf of our clients. One of the things that I was really surprised to hear this morning from Sheriff Lands was with respect to, I think the press was asking him why OSBI had not come in to investigate. I don't know who it was that asked that question, but it's a good question. And his response was essentially, I'm on the board of OSBI, and I could kind of control that investigation. That concerns me because in 2011, an inmate who had never been arrested before, never been charged with a crime until 2 hours after he died, was investigated by the OSBI. There were no criminal charges that resulted from that investigation, and I think that anyone in the world who watches that video, and it's online, it's Elliot Williams' jail death, anyone who watches that video would agree with me that criminal charges should have been filed, period, against all of those people that provided care, or didn't provide care. And so I'm going to provide some more information on that and that OSBI situation later, but I don't want to distract from the record. And I'm going to be here all afternoon if you guys want to ask questions. Just don't attack on the questions, and I'll try to, well, you can attack me, but just do it one at a time.
Back to the tattoo thing, what is that supposed to lead to? Because we said at the last press conference, the family said that they didn't think that race was a governing factor here. Apparently, they've also been cleared by the FBI. Where are we supposed to take away from that part of it?
From the tattoo or the FBI?
From the tattoo and not being whether there's a racial issue there.
I don't think Eric's family doesn't know about the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office. They don't want this case to be about race. There's Caucasians that I represent and that my brother and I have represented for years that have died as a result of systematic deficiencies in the jail. So it's not just a race issue, right? I mean, it's just a dehumanization issue. When you dehumanize inmates or you dehumanize people on the streets, that even if they're involved in some kind of undercover operation, you have the results that you see on the videotape with Elliot Williams, and you have the results that you see in the videotape with Eric Harris. And so I don't think it's just a race issue, but it is an issue that should have been resolved, in my opinion, in 2010, earlier, but at least as of 2010 when this became public. And I certainly don't think promoting someone to a major's position over the Violent Crimes Task Force is the way to handle that situation.
So you're saying you think that is a part of this? You think race is a part of this?
I don't know what was in those guys' heads when they did what they did. I just know that what I saw was really wrong, both procedurally and on a human level. And what their intent was, I don't know. But I think that when you have hate tattoos and you have been reported to have done certain things with African American inmates off camera, that certainly should be investigated. And I don't think you should be given a promotion. And the problem with a lot of this stuff is, well, that's just Smolen talking about it. Or that's just his client talking about it. And there's no investigation, there's no follow-up, there's no idea that, well, maybe this guy doesn't like minorities, and maybe this guy really is violent. So that's my issue with it. I'm not passing judgment on it. I just think that pursuant to their own written policies, that it should be investigated.
Well, in talking about policies, I've asked them several times about the policies, and they've basically said that if it's an internal affairs issue, that it shouldn't be talked about in this investigation. Obviously, you disagree with that, because that's the answer I got.
Well, I mean, what about the internal affairs? Like, to even talk about it?
Well,
But these are
that's not that. They're saying that's not part of the criminal investigation,
look.
so that's something they should be able to deal with on their own.
They also have a written policy that says an IA investigation is supposed to be completed in 30 days or 60 days. I have to pull a policy. It's either 30 days or 60 days. And if it's not going to be completed, they have to write out why, and the undersheriff has to approve why that it's not going to be completed at that certain amount of time. And this is 2010.
What kind of relevance would the examination of tattoos on your witness have on this particular case?
On the case of Eric Harris, or the case that was being litigated when that deposition was taken?
Either one.
Well, the case that was being litigated when the videotape was taken was a racially hostile work environment claim by African American officers who were employed by the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office. And so there was a lot of relevance to it, in one being that the African American employees were highly offended by his presentation of that because they felt like it was hostile. There were other allegations. You can look those cases up. They're all public, and I'll be giving you handouts that reference them. But, you know, here's Mr. Huckabee walking down the hall with Mr. Bates and Clark Brewster's son and Scott Wood behind him, and he's wearing long sleeves, and I believe he's wearing long sleeves for a reason.
Are there any other relevant tattoos on other officers?
Not that I'm aware of.
Was there a close relationship between the company and Bombay?
Absolutely. And I think that that's going to come out. I think there were some questions early on in the Eric Harris shooting about vacations being taken and who had vacationed with Mr. Bates. And I think that their response was, what they do on their personal time is of no concern to you. And I disagree with that position. I think that it is important when you can't come up with training records and you can't come up with qualification records and you can't come up with anything except that Mr. Bates has a personal relationship with these guys. I think they do need to disclose that. Sheriff Lance, for the first time this morning, spoke publicly and said, yeah, I've been to the Bahamas with them once or twice. Well, I want to know if Mr. Huckabee's been on vacations with them, and if so, how many? And I'd like to know how many weapons that he's bought them. And I'd like to know how much money he's given them, if any. And I think they just need to come out and say it. Instead of saying it's private and it's of no concern to you, it's highly offensive to the family. I mean, they're on a vacation. You know, Sheriff Blands, I think, this morning said he was out of town with his wife. I mean, I was at a memorial service for Eric Harris with his family and my kids. And I think it's highly offensive. And I think that the reaction by the sheriff's office is highly offensive.
What was the Harris family's reaction to Sheriff's apology today, and how do they feel about the direction this is headed, now talking about these tattoos?
Andre is mowing yards today, and he asked me to let him mow his yards, and I said, okay, mow your yards. So I don't know, but I'll ask him tonight, and I'll probably issue a statement. He's trying to get his life as to normal as he can, and he's just constantly bombarded with questions and people wanting to talk to him. So I feel like, he's got this deal where he's lost his brother and best friend, which I don't even know how I would react to that. And so I think that he's just trying to deal with it, and him going and mowing yards and doing what he does for a living helps him get in the right place.
Is there any significance to the tattoos of Huckabee Jr.?
Not that I'm aware of.
What do you feel the significance? I understand the training records, but like the personal relationship
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're not trained, okay, and if you've got all the policies and they apply the policies to everybody except for the guy that takes them on vacations and buys them weapons and buys them trucks and buys them cars, and then there's a problem. It's systemic. It's not just, hey, we lost the training records, or hey, we don't know if he was trained or not, or hey, we can waive training requirements if we want to. I'm the sheriff. I mean, you killed a guy in the middle of the street with video cameras everywhere. Unarmed. I think it's very significant to know why he was there.
And have you seen the Dollar General video?
Yeah?
Is that something we're ever going to see? Does it say anything different?
I think there's some aspects of that are concerning, particularly the sheriff's office going into their security room and watching the footage of it. There was some confusion, I think, this morning. Some of them said they had it. Some of them said they didn't have it. I'm not going to speculate, but maybe because it wasn't produced at the DA's office. I don't know why there's confusion about whether or not you've got videotapes of a shooting. But there is a rear camera shot where you can see the shooting happen, but it's time-lapsed in the version that I have, with about a 3-second time lapse. What's important for me, though, is when I watch the video of, I believe it's Deputy Hess, that goes into their security room and he's watching the cameras and he's taking notes, and you can see the employee in there make a phone call. I don't know who she called, but what they're watching is not time-lapsed in that room, and you can tell when you watch the video. I'll release it. I mean, I don't have a problem releasing the Dollar General videos, but I'm just telling you that the kicker is you need the non-time-lapse version of it, which I know exists, because you can see it being played in the security office. Because it's that 3 seconds that's not in the time-lapse version that I have where the shooting takes place. But it's off in the background and you can see it behind the fence.
Do you have a list of the model numbers and make of the cameras used in that video, specifically the time-lapse camera?
I do not have that. I do not have that.
If you're doing a morning operation, you would charge that up to the last one after.
I mean, look, I'm not going to, yes, certainly if you're going to videotape an operation and it's the first one of the day, according to Mr. Bates' statements, you'd make sure that you'd have that camera charged up. And I think that it's highly suspect, and again, I'm not making any allegations, but it's highly suspect that it happens to cut off after the guy says, F your breath. And I think if you were to frame by frame that video, you'd see some people's fists like that. So, look at the video. Frame by frame. Any other questions?
I have one question. What would you say to the sheriff's office? I know the first time they held a press conference where they released the video, we kept asking about why Bates brought his personal weapon to the undercover sting, and their argument was that many law enforcement officers bring their personal weapons when they're not in uniform.
Well, I showed you, like, the argument that he's off duty or if he's not in uniform, whatever it is, the policy is what it is. You're going to have a copy of it. They won't show you their policies for a reason.
Would there be any significance to the history of that 357?
Not the history of the 357, but what type of weapon it is. If you were to talk to some people that know weapons better than I do, I think that they would really tell you some interesting things about the weapon, and I think it's interesting that he was using a .38 caliber instead of a .357 round. It was a lower round. If you look at the report from him, he shot him with a .38 caliber bullet.
Well, I was getting straight out going with this. Who sold it to him?
I don't know. But I don't think that there's going to be an issue with the sale of that gun. It's more of what type of gun that is and what that gun is used for. Anybody else? All right. Thank you, guys. I appreciate you coming.